Excellent. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to Robson Square here today for Word Vancouver, which is always festival. I get to see you. Yeah, we get to see you here as well. I certainly want to thank the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people for. We want to give that acknowledgement. They have a long tradition of storytelling. We have a little tradition of storytelling we're working on. It's not as great as theirs, but everybody's doing their best in this day and age. Um, we're here with Eve Lazarus today. This is a treat because I don't get to see you all the time because you live off in another city called North Vancouver. I've never visited there. You didn't even cross a bridge or anything. Yeah, but we've had some talks like this before, but we're so if you've seen us together talk, hopefully we'll get into some new territory here as well. But if you haven't seen Eve and I discuss, in particular, your book before or your books, that's what we're going to get into today. We're also going to talk a little bit in my own small, humble way. I've written a couple things myself, don't you know? And because often even I compare notes or sometimes work off each other, sometimes not knowing it at first, because sometimes we cover the same territory. We'll get maybe a little bit into some stuff as well, or something comparative that maybe helps us. Especially. That sound good to you?
That's good. Yeah.
Excellent. I joked around a little bit earlier today, saying with this hour of the day, if it's acceptable to talk about murder and whatnot, or having a little bit of murder for brunch and whatnot. And sometimes you have to have a dark sense of humor when dealing with some of this stuff, just for your own relief. But this is a serious subject, and uh, sometimes I don't know how you feel, Eve. Sometimes true crime in itself gets treated sometimes a little too flippantly. When at the end of the day, as your book really indicates, there's family members and people who have to live with this legacy of a family member that has been murdered. And I can't think of any worse specter or a shadow to follow you throughout your life with this thing. And maybe you could speak about it just in some of your interviews or dealings with some of these subject matters. Um, what's been your impression of that? Like you always that you do have to be. This is a serious subject we're getting at, and what you sometimes keep in mind in dealing with the sensitivities of speaking to family members.
Uh, yeah, I've noticed in the last couple of years in particular, as true crime podcasts have just exploded, and we're getting all these crazy things like Mimosas True Crime, and I can't think of half the titles. And I mean, I do a true podcast as well, but it just seems to be they've taken the families and the victims out of these shows. It's just become pure entertainment, and I find that interesting. And I guess I started this years and years ago. I fell into it. I was writing history books and I was writing actually a sensational Vancouver, and it was a kind of crazy idea that the house has a genealogy or a social history like a person, and it was telling the story of the house through the people that lived there and the events that took place. And I wrote a chapter about murders in the houses, and it was just I didn't spend a lot of time on each one. I got a couple that intrigued me from Vancouver Police Museum, like the Paul's murder, and sort of got a bit interested in that, in the history of it as well. The Pauls were murdered in 1958. They were the murder in Vancouver, and I just wrote that up and wrote up several other murders, and I just really wanted to find out more about the victims. I found it was just not enough to write about this brutal murder. I wanted to know more about the victims. And one of the people that came up was a woman called Evelyn Roche, and she was a 39-year-old too. And when I'd written about her in Sensational, Vancouver, in the house that she was killed in, which was just down from Van Dyck on 7th and Penticton, I just wondered what happened to her kids. It said that she just married again, that they just moved into a house. And after Sensational Vancouver came out, I started digging into it. And that actually became the cover of Cold Case Vancouver in 2015. And I found the two children who were in their 70s, right? And they told me the story of their mother. And that just intrigued me to be able to tell the story. And I realized talking to them that even though been 60 odd years since this had happened, that they never stopped thinking, they never stopped wanting to get answers. And so every story in the book, in Cold Case Vancouver, I worked very, very closely with the families, and I got to know them really well and to care about them. So this is a really roundabout way of saying that whenever I'm writing something, I think something or podcasting something, I think the families are listening to this or could be listening to this. Am I comfortable with what they're hearing? And I think we talked about this as journalists too. In journalism school or when you're working for a newspaper, you're always told never show the source your copy before it goes to print. And once I started doing this, I completely threw that on its ear and worked very closely with the families. And I know in the case of Lindsay Nichols, she was a 14-year-old girl that went missing in 1993, I think it was, from Comox. And I worked with her mother, I worked with her father, who's now CP officer, who was split up, and I worked with her sister. And I think showed them multiple drafts. And it just turned out to be such a stronger case. And the same with one of the first stories in Cold Case Vancouver. It was Jenny Conroy. She was a war worker in 1944. She was 24 years old. She worked at the shipyards and later the grain elevators. And she was murdered and the body was dumped above the highway in West Vancouver. And it came out later that she was an unmarried mother. And the press just brutalised this poor girl. In the papers, her parents didn't know that she'd had a baby. She'd hidden that from them. And basically, police and press just blamed her for a murder. And when I started writing about this, I heard about it through the North Vancouver archives. Jane Ed, I was doing this book, and I said, I've just come across this photo album from 1944, and it says Jenny Conroy, and it's got all these pictures of her family and everything. Are you interested? And I said, oh my God, yes, and jumped in the car and went down and took a look. And because Cold Case Vancouver was with my editor, I thought, I'm not going to be able to do this. So I wrote a blog post, and weirdly the next day, his niece with me and told me that Jen's daughter was alive, well, living in New Zealand with 5 children, and was still, after 70 years, desperate for answers in her mother's unsolved murder. So I called her and said, oh, I'd love to get this case in the book. And she said, well, you've got a week. What that's like. Most of these chapters take months and months of research and work. Anyway, we did it, and I ended up writing this chapter with Mary's daughter and Mary's niece. And I thought it was one of the strongest in the book. So long way of saying, I really, whenever possible, try to collaborate with the families and make sure that they're comfortable with what is coming out.
Yeah, and I didn't. To backtrack, I didn't necessarily introduce even what our backgrounds are necessarily, but you have a background in journalism primarily. I have a background in history, academic, whatnot, and there's things that I've written about in terms of city history, municipal history, and whatnot. And that's always an interesting concept, the idea where you're not supposed to show, what you've written until. But I've broken that role too, certainly in the case. And I don't know if it's ever been something that's presented to you in that way that you think the only way I'm going to get these people to talk to me is if I give it. Look, I'll tell you, and I've said this to some people, and I've said this to police who don't want to go on record, to uh, active criminal gangsters who don't necessarily want the press, but they read one of my books and they sort of see where I'm coming at, and they're okay to talk to me. Don't use my name, Aaron, or don't use it. If you use the story, everybody's going to know it's going to come from me. That's that could be an issue for people. Uh, but presenting it as, look, before this goes to the printers, I'll let you read everything I've written about. And sometimes that seems like I don't know what rules we're breaking journalistically or ethically or literally, in that sense, because you're going to have people come back, and sometimes the benefit, I think, is sometimes people say, "Oh, you're from 2 different events here, and it was 2 separate days," just for that detail, so you get the story right. But sometimes that's the only way it feels like sometimes people can talk, and I've told this to you, and I don't mean it as a snub. I never tell people I'm a journalist. I don't have the journalism background necessarily you do. I've certainly worked in journalism, but my roots are as a historian. So I sometimes think because journalists in this day and age get sometimes across the board a bad rap. I don't want to talk to a journalist. Uh, there's that fear. I sometimes try and placate people's fears, saying, "Look, I'm not looking for a gotcha moment as a journalist. I'm trying to make you or anybody else look back here. I'm just trying to find out what happened." Which in the end is what any journalist, historian, any writer should be looking for the truth, obviously. And it's just how we go about it is interesting to me. But has that presented itself to you in that you've been able to open people up a little bit by saying just that you'll show them the manuscript or you'll tell them what you've written about them just to get the detail right of anything else?
Yeah, I think it's a comfort level,
Yeah,
and you're right. People think it's a gotcha moment
yeah,
that, and people think I think that we're controversial. We're always looking for controversy, and that is just not true. We're looking for the well, at least I think with us, and with our history backgrounds and so forth, we're looking for the truth. And yeah, and if I've got a detail wrong or God forbid spelled the name wrong, you don't want to see that happen in a book or anywhere. And I'm corrected. I mean, that's terrific. I'm really happy about that. And the weird thing I've noticed, though, I kind of noticed this as well, when you're writing about horrendous things, very, very personal things, and maybe the worst thing that someone's ever gone through in their life. And they'll look it over and they'll say, "You said we had an oak tree in the backyard. That's an elm. Could you change that?" And everything else is fine. Yeah, thanks. And
yeah,
it's
yeah,
always a surprise how comfortable that they are once they've seen that. And, occasionally they'll say, "I don't want that information out," and that's okay. It's out. Yeah.
yeah, certainly. In the case of a book with Michael, The Last Gang in Town, I was interviewing some former and I guess current, these guys never leave, Clark Park gang members, and some of these people have Hells Angels affiliations. And I got a call one day on a Sunday. It's a quick anecdote here. I was supposed to do an interview with somebody, and about 2 o'clock, about 1:45, phone rings, and I think it's the guy calling, and he says, "Well, tell me about the book." And I sort of told him the preamble. I just thought maybe he wanted a refresher. So I said, "Well, it's about this and that, and that's why I'm looking into this, and I was hoping to find out about that and track down this person if they're still around or whatnot." And I realized that the person I thought I was supposed to be talking to, this was a different person, and he wanted to know exactly what I was writing about and poking around asking these questions. And he was obviously with the organization of gentlemen that ride motorcycles for a living quite a bit, and you see them around their vests and whatnot. I won't even go further than that. And he said, "Well, the thing is, Aaron, there's lots of people still alive from those days. Some sensitive issues sometimes. So we'd prefer if you didn't write about two people." And they named the two people. Didn't recognize the names at first. I should have recognized one of them. And I didn't want to agree to anything. I didn't know who this guy was as much as I thought I was sort of being threatened to not write about some things. I thought, well, I think the stuff I'm writing about is kind of before these guys, which in a way it was. But and he says, well, that's fine, fine. And then it was weird. It sort of pivoted because he said, it's an interesting subject there. Very, those are crazy times back then. He goes, you're that kid that wrote the Commodore book, right? Oh, yeah. And he goes, oh, I really enjoyed that. And I thought, these guys sitting around reading my books in the clubhouse or something. I thought it was the strangest thing ever. Yeah, did you go to the library? You got a library card? Like, yeah. So, and he actually gave me some suggestions, which was weird. And then he kind of wound up the phone call. I said, "Well, Aaron, good luck. I look forward to reading the book when it comes out." But he said it in a way I still remember the tone. I can't imitate it. He looked forward to the book when it comes because he seemed legitimately. He says, That's an amazing time in Vancouver history." He was just talking about the whole period back then. But he also was looking forward to reading it and make sure those two names were in the book. So I hang up and I immediately called one of the Clark Park gang people I'd been talking to who was sort of helping facilitate some of this, introducing me to people. And I said, "Hey, man, I think I just got threatened on the phone to not write about a couple of people here. I didn't recognize the name." And it turns out one of the names was the head of the chapter of the East Van organization, which I will leave out. And he said, "Aaron, don't worry, but look, I talked to them. I said, I told them what we were doing because I thought it's better to tell them what we're talking about rather than us be called to a sit down and have some trouble with it later. Everything's fine. But the reason why they don't want you to mention some of these people is because they're active members, and that organization, thanks to Levine books and some of those organized crime books that came out back east that show their logos and stuff like this, they feel if you're going to talk about them, then you owe them money. So they don't wanna send a guy with a baseball bat down to your publishers with an invoice for 10 grand or something like this. So it's I just wanna tell them we're all and I kind of breathed a sigh of relief, but I also thought, God, I can't imagine, you know, Brian and Robert at Arsenal Press responding to a biker with a baseball bat, showing up wanting to get this appearance on some subject. So in the end, it worked out quite well, and it was fine, and, those people actually weren't so central to the story. They were a little too young, and they were kinda were aware and were around then, but I managed to sort of steer when that book came out, I thought for sure was gonna upset somebody, either on the police or some of the organized crime people that were involved. And the funny thing that Christmas, I got a call from Ryan Honeyborn, a retired police officer, said, "Geez, Aaron, every retired cop in the city got your book for Christmas. Everybody loves it." I get calls, I thought, "Geez." And then I got a call from one of the old gang members that every retired or active biker in the city got your book for Christmas, and they all love it. So somehow I managed to get the Titanic through the iceberg field, but I was worried about it. But the only way I could really do it is try and be honest with people and say that exactly what you're saying, just saying, "Look, I'll let you," and it was helpful too, because those guys got back to me saying, "Well, some of these it's not the same incident, or just for your clarity," but everybody was fairly cool. In fact, I think sometimes in the aftermath, some people were disappointed they weren't mentioned, like, because some of these everybody has an ego to a certain extent. Um, it's a funny thing writing a book or working on it. What I wanna ask you even, it's such a broad question, but especially in the wake of, Cold Case Vancouver, your decision to do Cold Case BC, and I wonder if we can anticipate a Cold Case Canada at some point, or you're gonna be yeah, yeah, uh, but how do you do your research? What's the first step? Are there obviously, you start abroad and you move in and, has the blog been helpful? Has things like that? I'm curious basically how right from the inception, how you put some things together.
Well, with Cold Case, BC, it was kind of a lot of the research, I guess, and the cases came to me. After Cold Case Vancouver came out, I talked about sort of dealing with a lot of the families and getting to know them and things like that. It felt really weird just to walk away. These were cases that I'd chosen that were really little known, hadn't been talked about or heard about for decades, and even at the time, they're often just a few newspaper clippings. So it was great to get them out in the book. It was great to get some publicity for them. Um, but I just didn't want to leave it there. So I started up a Facebook page called, at that time, Cold Case Vancouver. And really as a way to just remember the victims and with any draw out some more information. Because a lot of the cases I write about were way before 1996 when DNA first came out on the scene. And in those days, police weren't always very kind to evidence. It got contaminated, it got lost, it got thrown out. So in most of these cases, there's very little there, and we're not gonna solve it through genealogy or stuff like that. So really the only way I think things are gonna be solved is if someone comes forward with new information that might help police. So by putting them out on the page, I thought, not only does it somewhere to talk about them, remember them, but in a best case scenario, someone might come forward with new information that can help. But what I found out was I was flooded with cases from people, from family members and things like that, that wanted, their own family members or friends, teachers or whoever, remembered. And so I'm happy to do that. And suddenly I've got hundreds of it's just frightening how many unsolved murders there are. And then I started with missing people cases, particularly missing children, which is particularly heartbreaking. And so I started adding them to the page, and every now and then, a cold case would get solved. It doesn't happen very often, but occasionally it does, and I wanted to put those in as well. So that all really got translated into Cold Case BC. It's really one-third unsolved murders, one-third solved, and one-third missing people, and a lot of the cases just came to me. As far as research after that, with these older cases, it's brilliant because if for research purposes, before 1970, the inquests were all available through BC archives, and they're expensive, but they have just this wealth of information that's really never been seen before. So that's been really, really effective. Finding people, again, back to Facebook. Wow, that's just been a huge breakthrough. Uh, Sometimes I can find someone just in 3 minutes. I'm like, "Oh my god, that was too easy. Where's the fun in that chat?" Whereas before you'd be at the library through microfilm and doing all of that stuff. Newspapers.com came on the scene 2 years ago and completely changed everything. Where we'd have to go to the Vancouver Library, and they actually had they probably still do, but they had murder files, cabinets and cabinets of murder files with all the clippings. So I'd go through those, spend a few, days every week, going through the files, seeing what was there that was back when I was doing Columbians Vancouver, and going through the microfiche, which all of us who've done that know that. After 2 hours of that, you sort of shoot yourself in the head. It's just hideous. And then newspapers.com just revolutionized all of that. So that's just been brilliant as a starting point. But usually once I connect with the families, I find so much of the original information was just wrong. It just got repeated and repeated over and over again. So it also gives me a chance to correct that and tell the proper stories.
It's just to reflect on the newspaper.com because I had a funny conversation with you about it. Prior to this, just to explain to those of you maybe who are not researchers or haven't done that thing, at the top floor of the Vancouver Public Library, there are newspaper on microfiche and various newspapers, Province Sun, Georgia Straight, whatnot, and you can go through those and you can search for things. But it's basically like you've been given every newspaper since time immortal, and find the one that you're looking for. And you can't search microfiche, but with the advent of newspaper.com, you can now keyword search a name, yourself even, uh, and find those issues, and they come up on your screen. You can do it in the privacy of your own home in your pajamas, and do that work. When I was working on the Commodore Ballroom book, I I went through every issue of the Georgia Straight going back to 1973 to copy the entertainment listings on microfiche, so I could do those archives. And it was like making the Great Wall of China with pieces of Lego. It took years. People were when I told them what I was doing, they were astonished. They said, "What you need professional help if you're gonna take on a project." But it eventually, that built the show archive for every night of shows, every concert, going back to 1973 and then some up until 2015 when we sort of stopped. We're gonna reactivate it. Um, but that was a tremendous, change because now you could if you knew something happened in August 1967, you could at least look through 30 days of newspapers and find something, but that's where now you just type in the subject or the person or the name you're looking for or whatever keywords it might help, and now you can find those very newspaper issues. And I remember joking with you at the time saying, "Geez, are we out of a job?" Like, because it felt like suddenly the anybody can do it, and you can, but of course, you still need somebody to tell the story, and that's hopefully we're
Nerdy.
Yes.
I remember us all, and I think Jesse Donaldson, we're all sitting in the London hotel having a beer one night, and I can't remember what we got in the discussion about, but it was some historical fact, and it was like, "Oh, no, it's 10 to 9, we can't make the library." Who else would
To go check it. Oh,
we can all do it. Again, before newspaper.com, now I guess we get the iPad out or
Yeah.
something. But yeah, no, it's true, and
It certainly changed, and
yeah,
made our work better, I think, because
yeah,
they were stuck with something we miss, like, or because we just didn't find that issue at the time. But
yeah.
now we're able to find out so much more.
But I think you're right, when you talk about connecting with story, and I'm doing, um, a panel at Whistler Writers Festival next month, and I have to write a blog about connecting with story, and I was just thinking about that yesterday, how I do that. And a lot of it, I use in Cold Case BC, I wrote about, missing women and, murdered Indigenous women up north, 3 cases, and because I was absolutely staggered when I read the statistics, there was something like over 1,300 missing and murdered women across Canada, unsolved, and that to me is just staggering. 26% of that, more than a quarter of all these cases, are in BC. Like, this is a national tragedy, and we just don't seem to be seeing more about it. But it's just a statistic. until you start putting a face and a story to that statistic, it doesn't connect people. And I think that's when I was thinking through that, using that as an example, I think that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm taking those statistics and that horror and trying to put a human face to it and tell these people's stories and hopefully make people care. And, in a perfect world, bring about some change because we're seeing all these inquiries and it goes on and on and on, but nothing ever seems to change.
Yeah. That leads me to, the issue of police transparency, if we could talk about that, yeah. Um, of course, and everybody would understand that, the police have to keep, especially an active investigation or something that's still open, that is a cold case still. They have to keep some facts to themselves to be able to, if somebody comes forward and says they've done it, maybe they're just reciting the facts they saw in the papers or somebody off their rocker, something like this. And the police are obviously, especially in Canada, uh, because of privacy issues. I wanna maybe put that in italics, if I can, if you're in your mind when I say that phrase. Um, uh, that seems to be an overriding thing of accessing information. It's very difficult to get any is if anybody's filed a freedom of information request with Vancouver Police Department, you yeah, you can ask some very specific questions, um, and you'll maybe get a page or something, if that. Might which you can appeal, and sometimes you get more. But yeah, yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that, or how it was? I can speak to that too, but I want to hear from you first.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest challenges and continues to be in writing about, unsolved murders. Missing people slightly better, not much. Um, and it is a real problem, especially with old cases. My last FOI I put through I was talking about the Paul's murder, case, a triple murder in '58. Still unsolved. Pretty much nothing's been done. It probably hasn't been done for decades. So I filed an FOI, it was turned down. I filed another one saying, so much time's gone by. They refused it again because there could be family members still alive that
Yes.
might be affected. You would think family members would want answers, or at least to know that they're looking into these cases. It just seems to me a really effective way of shutting us down in the media and stopping information getting out. Because we know a lot of these cases aren't being looked at. They're sitting in banker boxes all around the province in RCMP storage lockers gathering dust. They haven't been looked at for years and won't be looked at until something comes up. And I know this because when I get an answer, it's like, it's they're not digitized. They're just not being looked at. And I think, what you were saying as well, and what we don't want is police to hold back evidence, hold back being maybe it was a method of murder, maybe it was, a bite mark, maybe it was something that, they could use in a Mr. Big sting later on, or if they ever do catch the suspect, they can use that to, make sure that he's the proper one. We don't want that. In no way do we want to get in the way of investigation. We want these cases solved. But there's a lot of information that they could be providing that we could get out that could bring in more information. And, the lack of transparency, particularly by the RCMP. I asked, I think I told you about this, missing children and missing people in general figures are put out by the RCMP every year, and they're staggeringly ridiculous. Um, 28,000 or something a year. Now, this includes people that, "Oh, hello, my husband's late home for dinner. He's gone missing." "Oh, okay, here's a stat. To my teenage son, didn't come home last night. He's probably his girlfriend." Okay, that's the number. To, my 3-year-old was taken off the front balcony 10 years ago and is still missing. It's been abducted. That's all included there. So I was trying to get some clarification about that. Who's actually missing? Who's missing after, say, a year or some fundamental thing, and who is likely not to have chosen to go missing or, drowned in a boat accident or whatever. People have been abducted, and you can't get that information. And I got this email back saying, "Well, we need to know all this stuff about you who's public," and I'd sent the publishing information, "but we need to know more about this who's signing the licensing agreement on my behalf." I had to write back and say, "I'm trying to clarify publicly available statistics, not writing about the RCMP or, you know, making them into a cartoon or something. I'm not doing that." And they wouldn't provide any context at all until I found one very brave officer who was able to sort of walk me through it and tell me that they were completely ridiculous, these numbers. So, we've seen Chelsea Foreman. I think we were chatting about her case the other night. She was the young Indigenous woman who went missing 2 years ago and then was found in a Shaughnessy property. The VPD did a big press conference. They say, "We don't know the cause of death, but we believe it's undetermined." And it was kind of case closed. And of course, the family were horrified by saying, "How can you close the case if and say it was no foul play if you don't know how she was murdered? How can you do that?" And I think it's technically open. But again, they're not providing information because it's technically an unsolved case.
Yeah, and so often is the case that you sometimes only get any information by connecting with an officer, active or retired, who most often retired, who can maybe shed some light on something. Um, when I was working on Vancouver Vice, which was my last book, I'd been interviewing a number of Vancouver police officers who had worked on the Vice Squad. We don't actually have a Vice Squad anymore in Vancouver, which is even more interesting. Well, there we go. Yeah, we're the only ones working these things now, apparently. Um, uh, but I've been interviewing some officers, and there's a murder that happened in the West End in 1984 that I specifically wanted to look into, and I happened to be speaking to a retired officer, and I said he'd actually just retired within that year, I guess. And I said, "Look, I'm going to file this FOI request. So if you don't want to tell me anything, that's fine. But I would sort of like to know. So often is the case when you file for freedom of information request, you're only getting the answers to the questions you ask, and how specifically you ask may be the difference of getting an answer or not. So I said, I'm just hoping to get something. If I can ask some more specific, I don't know what's in the file. And he goes, well, let me do it for you. And I thought, you're retired. How are you going to do that? And he's got some friends in the department. He could still look something up. And he called me a few days later, and I said, "Well, I got the file right here." And when he started, and I record my telephone calls, uh, so I just let him read the thing out, which was great. Suddenly, I had the whole file without an FOI request, basically. And I said, "I'd like to." He was describing some photos, some crime scene photos, and I said, "What? Geez, I'd still like to see these pictures. I don't know, you know." And he goes, and this was just when COVID had started, so everything was shut down. He goes, "Where? You want to meet somewhere?" I thought, well, everything's kind of closed. There's no coffee shops in my immediate area, and I live down at the east end of Falls Creek by the train station down there. He goes, and I said, well, I'll meet you at the train station. So it felt like a spy meeting. I was showing up, and I said, well, I'll open my umbrella in the train station. That'll be me because we hadn't met in person before. We just knew each other through kind of reputation or through the books, and I was aware of him. But he let me look at everything, I said, can I take a picture of this just for reference? Yeah, it's okay. And, don't I didn't say that I got that information from him or anything like that, but then when I filed my FOI request and all the specific stuff I asked for, almost I was able to say, "I want this on page 5 and this on page 10." And I think the people down at FOI at the Vancouver Police Privacy Office thought, "Where have you seen" in fact, they did ask, "It sounds like you've got some of this information already." And I go, "Well, I spoke to a retired officer who worked on the case. He's passed away now. His family, has some stuff, and they showed it to me," which was a lie, and I didn't wanna get the guy I knew. Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. Well, the book's out now, so I got nothing to worry about. And I but I and that's something I think in my case, especially in my case, almost maybe more just because, over the course of the Vancouver Vice and also the book I wrote on the history of the Penthouse nightclub and the raid there that the Vice bought in 1975 and over the course of years, I was able to somewhat cultivate, a reputation with quite a few retired Vancouver Police Department people they sort of saw where I was coming from and felt that I was okay to talk to. And it's interesting when you do speak to some of those retired guys. Sometimes they don't want to talk at all because either the stuff they saw on the job just ate at them, and that's the past for them now, or they were looked over for some promotion, and as soon as they quit the job, all they care about is their pension now. I'd hate to have a job like that. You work for 25, 30 years, and you never want to think about it again, or you're retired with some animosity or sour grapes or whatever it is, awful prison to be in, like but then you do get people who do who like the job still like talking about it and whatnot, and they still think about it, they dream about it, and whatnot. And if you're asking the right questions and you come with the right respect and if they see where you're coming from, you can get them to open up. And, even I are what I refer to, as members of the Belshaw gang, uh, and, Tom Carter, another one of our gang affiliates here, it was a term that I came up with, in regards to Vancouver Noir and John Belshaw, and it should be the Belshaw Pervy Gang, actually, but, John Belshaw, one of the co-authors of Vancouver Noir, which I thought at the time was a kind of came at a crucial crossroads, that book. Um, in my mind, people like ourselves and Tom and probably 10 other people in town. You and me probably, because of our output, probably more a little bit more visible. You even more so, thanks to the podcast and everything like that. People don't know who I am, they know who you are. Um, there's been an interesting sort of renaissance in the last 10, 15 years in terms of books about Vancouver, not just crime, entertainment history, different different histories of the city, that there's never been a better period, to me, of books and material and new people working on the subject of some of this stuff. And that's been really interesting to see. I think they will look back on this period, and they will hopefully refer to the Belshaw Gang, like the Group of Seven or something like that. That's what I think of when I go to bed late at night anyway.
Sure.
And hopefully still on the shelves, yeah. And sometimes in our work, we've crossed over, in some stuff. There's a case. Can you talk about the alley murders, in that sense, and a little bit about that if you can?
I was just thinking that when you were talking about retired police
Yeah.
officers, because it's kind of a cliche when you hear, one, there's always a case that they didn't solve that keeps them up at night. But there is, it seems to be there is. And I guess that's why they're so keen to talk about us. And I guess they trust us, which is great. But just to get that information out. And one of them was the Alley murders. Now, I'd never heard of this. I've read a little bit about it, but to me, that this is completely new territory. And I was
Heard
supposed to,
about one that
right.
you opened up, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was Lisa Gavin. And she was Lisa Gavin and um, name's gone.
Jerry?
No,
Ruth?
no, no, the other lady.
Heather?
That was with the friend. Anyway,
Yeah.
it'll come back in a second. There were two cultists that were murdered, young women, sex workers, in the late 1980s. And the VPD put them up on their cold case website last year. And the family got quite excited because they thought, they're looking into the murder of their loved one again, and that was all great. And I'd put it on my Facebook page. Lisa Garden was the first one. And a detective I know got hold of me and said, that was part of the Alley murders. We solved that. And the killer was a serial killer of 6 cases, died. And I said, "What? Why is it up on the cold case website then? I mean, there are hundreds, thousands of cases then. Why would they put that up?" So that was a bit of a mystery, and I got hold of another detective that I work with, a retired detective, on a number of these cases, and he'd worked on not Lisa's case, but the other young woman in 1980. And then he was part of this task force, this RCMP task force that was put together around 2005 to reinvestigate. And Alex, the detective, had been brought in. She'd been on missing women's files, Robert Picton's case. And then she'd been brought in to pull the DNA from a lot of the missing women. And it turned out that they had 6 sex workers. They found 2 DNA on Lisa Gavin's and another of the sex worker bodies. They found the body of another murdered woman behind the suspect's house in his garage, and the other 3 were connected through place and social connections and things. But there were definite 4 that had been murdered by the same person. So the Crown decided, because in BC, and I feel for the police in this, the police can't press charges, the Crown has to press charges. We're seeing this now all the time with catch and release. It must be so frustrating. Beats up someone 10 times a week, keeps getting let out, let out, let out. And so the Crown, even when the detectives took this to the Crown, the DNA of two of the bodies of the suspect and the body behind his house in a shed, naked, all with cocaine. He was a cocaine dealer. In their systems, they refused to push it forward. They said, "No, we need more evidence." So they followed the guy, they already had his DNA, had compared and got it, and they followed him around 24 hours a day because they were scared he was going to murder someone else. And in the end, they pulled him in and tried to get him to confess, and he wouldn't. And he was quite ill. He died without a confession. So they basically kept the cases unsolved. They call resolved. We know who did it.
I remember correctly, they even went to his deathbed.
Yes,
And
at
said,
the hospital.
"Now's the time."
Yes,
Off your chest, and he wouldn't do it. So yeah.
yeah. And so what we think must have happened is that the task force went ahead, but it was led by the RCMP. It's a different file. It's on a different computer system that the VPD use. And what the detectives think is that it was just a screw up. It never got the memo never got passed down. That they'd had the guy, and the VPD still have these cases up. The detectives went on my podcast because they wanted VPD come in to issue a press release and say, "Hey, we've found the person." And it was particularly heart-wrenching because the foster sister of Lisa Gavin has been pushing for answers for over 35 years, has been told nothing, was never told that they had a suspect, never told, he died, and thought that this guy was walking around, living his life while sister had been murdered. So after the podcast, after I had everything in place and got the podcast out, I called her and I said, "Sharon, you need to listen to this, and then you'll want to call me and talk it through." And she was just absolutely devastated. Called a meeting with the VPD, and they said, "Well, we didn't get a confession. There may have been someone else
Official.
involved, yada, yada, yada." But they couldn't, they didn't tell her any of this. And I just find that so incredibly upsetting and so unethical in a sense.
Yeah.
Don't tell the media, but at least tell the families that this guy is no longer walking around.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and dare I say, you and I, we have probably talked more with that cousin. I forget her name now.
Sharon,
Sure, that's it. Pardon me. Yeah, yes, foster sister. Pardon me. That's right. And we've talked to her more than the law enforcement. And I had originally written about Lisa Gavin because she was the sister um, of a Clark Park gang member. Her biological grandmother, Ruth Gavin, was one of the biggest heroin dealers. Fascinating criminal subject in town in the 1960s and 70s. Um, but and I had written about that, then sort of connected with you writing about this. So there's her name suddenly kind of appeared again. I think that's how Sharon reached out to us. And as I said, I think we've talked to her more than the VPD. Even if the VPD wouldn't have had anything official. I don't mean to knock the VPD. I think everybody idea what there is great. I realize some of the hurdles they have, but in many situations, it feels like that just by being a little bit more open, saying, "Look, this is what we pretty much think is happening," and at least to give that person or the family some evidence. We're not gonna be looking at that this much more because of this. We can't prove it 100, but all our instincts, and this is the reason why we feel this way, in this case, it would be the family sort of left hanging, doesn't hear anything. And unless people like ourselves sometimes shake a few coconuts from the tree, if you will, some information for them to and get by. I wanna talk about maybe what you're working on coming up or next or any future talks you're giving. You mentioned Whistler. But I wanted to open up with just the time we have since we got 50 minutes. Yeah, just for some time for questions if anybody has it, whether you're a reader or a writer or a researcher or you're interested in the subject or if you're not familiar with these books or you totally are or, whatnot. If anybody I wanted to leave that open. Anyway, go right in the middle here. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for your work already. Yeah.
I have some questions for you later.
Yeah, okay. Leave us your card. We're gonna talk to you right after. Oh, geez. Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Mhm.
You don't have a library card for the Toronto Public Library, do you? You don't have a Toronto Public Library card, do you? I've just put this out on my page. Um, just quickly, my new book is about the Empress of Ireland, and it was a ship that sank in 1914 off the coast of Rimouski. Now, more passengers died on that ship that night than died on the Titanic. But has anyone heard of it, by the way? Yeah, you don't count. I've had coffee with no, I've had coffee with both of them, told them all about it. So before talking to me, has anyone heard about it? Tom, what and I did this at the, Vancouver Historical Society to about 80 people, and I thought, "Oh, lots of people know about that." One person put up their hand. Um, but it's been interesting because I've been working with archives, but my frustration now is that I'm trying to get some clips from the Toronto Star News Daily or something like that, and it's only through the Toronto Public Library, and I have to have a card, but I have to live there to get the card. So I've been putting out these frantic things. If anyone lives in Toronto and has a library card, could they loan me the number for a day? And I'll, and, oh, okay, thank you. But I've been going for that book particularly. I've been going through different archives looking for old newspapers that haven't been digitised. And interesting enough, Tom, we're chasing an origin survivor of one of the origin story rather of one of the survivors. And again, it's 1914. Everyone's long dead, and a lot of the stories were just wrong. And ended up tracing the family, and they had an original letter talking about this guy's survival story, which was completely different from everything that was in the paper. And they traced it back to a local journal in Union, Ontario. It's a tiny little town of 3 people, feels like, a few farms. And they had Tom, who's the best researcher in the world, and just said, "Tom, any idea where," because it was ripped, we could only see, I think, B and AL or something at the end. Yeah. So Tom loves a challenge, and it turned out he found out it was this St. Thomas Journal in the middle of nowhere in 1914. And I was able to go through the archives and they were fabulous. They went and traced down the original story. And I just did that again last week with Merit. I was looking for another survivor, John Langley, and I'd had, I finally got hold of his grandchild, tracing him through various things over the years. It turns out he lives about 2 streets away as these weird things happen. But the archivists were able to dig up all these, tiny little newspapers long out of print that had actual interviews with him, so it's magical. So in that way, yeah, love you guys. Janet Smith. It's like, later. Right. Well, there you go.
Yeah, to add, that's literally where I think where we all first start is going to be with any kind of archive, whether it's BC, Vancouver archive, whatever it is. Sometimes the subject matter that we're delving into, there are no archive material about it, and we're the ones finding it, maybe, or creating it for the first time, but it's still where you start. And whether you're somebody investigating cold cases or investigating the history of some Vancouver nightclubs, or you're a house researcher and you're trying to find out when your home was built in Strathcona or any of these things, it's always going to be your first stop. And the people, if you, for those of you who've never been to the BC archives or Vancouver archives, that bunker-like building up by the planetarium there, the piece of Vancouver archives. Maybe you're sort of nervous to ask one of the very sort of bookish people who are working there with their head down, but these people are ultimately very friendly and ready to help. And actual, in many cases, if they kind of interested in what you're working on, they'll stop what they're working on just to help you. So and the amazing thing is, with any of this archival material, it's yours. Your tax dollars paid for it. It's free to you. You can look it up and on some of these Facebook groups, these nostalgia pages and whatnot, people produce these pictures and share these things, and they sort of passing it off as their own. And people say, "Oh, this is amazing! You have so many great photos," and they don't say, "Well, you're getting it from the Vancouver Archive. I can find this stuff for you." And people say, "Can you find this for me?" And they don't. They're just finding photos. So sometimes people pass these things off as their own when it's not. It's yours. Your tax dollars paid for it, and it's helping people like you that help us find stuff. And that's always going to be the first place to go. Then you sometimes will go out from there or whatnot, of course. But ultimately, as I say, whether you're doing anything, any kind of research, or you're curious about a time period or a place or a person, it's going to be and the fact that so much of that is online now. I'm a board member on the Friend of the Vancouver Archives, as is Tom Carter here, and we're trying to fundraise for the archives because, especially in the case of more recently, the whole archive of the Vancouver Sun and Province photo archives, which I think are some 2 million images in total, photographs. These are people who appear in newspapers, our history, places, people, whatnot, incidents. At the present rate, with only maybe 2 people scanning, it's going to take 80 years to get those all into digitized content that can be looked up and found. It's Tom and I's and a few other people's goal, and even if we could half that to 40 years, that would be nice by being able to fundraise some money and get some more archive down there. But if you're curious, get involved. Go check things out. There's so much fun stuff you can find. I was down in the archives one time, and I just pulled something off the shelf. I just picked out a random card and microfiche, and I put it on the thing and looked at it. And I found the most amazing stuff. I ate up the next 2 weeks of my life that I didn't have time to devote to and whatnot. Um, Next, let's jump to the question here.
I don't know if we've got more serial killers than anybody else. I think we have more opportunity, especially when you're looking at the northern cases. There's so much opportunity for predators, and it's just like this incredible hunting ground. Right? And you've got a lot of really destitute Indigenous people that have to get from A to B when there's no transport, little cell phone reception, they have to hitchhike. And I don't think that's changed very much. I think they've put some street lights up. They've changed a bit of cell phone coverage and things like that. But I don't think the bus systems are much better than they ever were. It's well, it could be anybody. It could be truckers. It could be tourists. It could be locals. It could be opportunity. It could be predators just preying on these people.
You don't have to be up north. You look at Willie Pickett.
Yeah.
Right down Vancouver has.
And the Valley, you've got the Valley murders, it's a group of serial killers in the 80s. You've got the alley murder killer, serial killer that was just killing sex workers. And I guess sex workers too are, easy. No one, police don't really bother too much. So again, it's
Well, I don't much. In many cases, I don't think it bother that much. I think in many cases, you're dealing with a situation that these people are in very vulnerable lives and are easy targets. I hate to say, certainly the cases can be made in the case of the Pickton case and even in the Green River Killer case when they let the information out to the public that these victims were sex workers. The public tended to think, well, they got what's coming to them, leading lives that are, which is a terrible thing. But that was yeah, for sure, yeah. And one question I asked you on another time that we got together, Eve, in the wake of Cold Case BC, is there any cases in there that you think will be solvable or maybe maybe even brought to the forefront in your book? Or is there something that's just hinging on being solved with the right information? Or do you think, how do you feel about that?
yeah, it's funny when Cold Case Vancouver came out, I'd really hoped that we'd see a whole bunch of solved cases, and of course we didn't. The only one that really came close to that was Babes in the Woods, and they were the 2 little boys that were found in Stanley Park in 1953, and for decades, it's been enduring Vancouver mystery story, and there was really not much hope that that would ever be solved, and part of the problem was that the bones were on display, for God's sake, at the Vancouver Police Museum for years, and then through the PNE, and then Brian Honeyburn at one point cremated a lot of the under the radar. So there are only very few bone fragments left of it, and very difficult to get the genome sequencing that they need to put through GEDmatch and the genealogical databases in the States. But they ended up, amazingly, they got enough DNA from the older boy to be able to do that and put it through and identify the 2 boys as David and Derek D'Alton. And that was just incredible. They still haven't identified the younger one. I don't know if they've got DNA, probably not. So we don't know anything about the fathers, and we don't know who murdered them, although the police have kind of thrown the mother under the bus on that one. But that was absolutely amazing. One of the reasons why I wanted to do a 30 books solved, so we could talk about the police investigation, and I don't. Again, I mean, it's just crushing to read unsolved case after unsolved case, but it also looks like the police aren't doing their job, and I certainly didn't want to leave that impression, because they are in many cases. When they solve these cold cases, it's so fascinating, either through the Mr. Big things where they solved 12-year-old Monica Jack's case and Gladys Wakabashi's case, and through the genetic genealogy, getting the Babes in the Woods their names back and solving 2 of the teenagers from Washington State. It's quite amazing.
We'll be sticking around for a little bit. Even if you have a few minutes, just in case if people want to ask something privately or come up or anything like that, you're more than welcome to me as well. Eve, where are you appearing next? We can find you you can find you on social media. We can find it, but you've got a podcast, and can you talk a little bit about that and the blog, of course?
Yeah, sure, thanks. I do a blog. I've taken a break from that now. I'm doing the new book, but it's called Every Place Has a Story, and there's tons of back information. I actually turned that blog into a book called Vancouver Exposed a couple of years ago. Do a podcast that initially came out of this, and it's called Cold Case Canada. First 2 seasons are Vancouver, and the second are Cold Case BC. And what I love about that is you can hear the voices. You can hear these retired homicide detectives talk about how difficult it was and the investigation. You can hear the family members talk about what they went through. You can hear from genetic genealogists like Cece Moore, the coroners like Mary Sedgin, and I love that. I love having their voices. It's really important. And my next gig, I'll be appearing the Whistler Writers on a crime panel on October 17th, I think. Thank you.
Good stuff. And for myself, you can certainly find me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and whatnot. I'm easy enough to track down. I've done many of these talks with Eve. I think we've done maybe 3 of these just with the book launch first, and then we did something last year. So, and I was speaking at a Vancouver history event, and this woman said, "Well, how come I've never heard of you before? I've heard of Eve Lazarus." And I thought, okay, this is the last time I'm going to host the Eve Lazarus thing. Get somebody else doing it. I got to get a piece of the pie myself here eventually. No, I'm very happy to do this with you, Eve, as always, and it's always a pleasure to hang out and chat. And it's been amazing to see the success of Cold Case BC. I think maybe your most successful book in terms of book sales, and number 1 on the BC bestsellers list for once. I jinxed it before, but I'm going to put my foot down. I'm at the BC Book Prizes. If this doesn't win the Bill Tutte Book Choice Award, I'm going to overturn the tables like Jesus upsetting the moneylenders in the church at that time, because I think you're due for it. And this book in particular has captured public's imagination so much. And it's interesting the question that when we talk about how, geez, why do we have so many serial killers have this crime? And to think about it, the crime statistics of British Columbia are not the crime statistics of Baltimore, Maryland, or Houston, or there's a certain fear out there, and when you see some of the crime incidents or stabbing that happened in China and any of these things, it's easy to think, oh my God, I don't want to stay in for the weekend. I'm not going, But this is a fairly peaceful place for all intents and purposes. There's always a dark underbelly, There was even one in Kerrisdale growing up when I was certain of it. But it's interesting that true crime has sort of captured Vancouverites' imagination in a way that's just as legitimate as everywhere else. Um, and um, and hopefully for all the right reasons with your book. And I do hope something gets solved and something can we'll turn back and somebody says, "Well, Eve Lazarus wrote about that in Cold Creek, BC." So I hope, and you never know what'll happen next. I'm going to be at the Rhodey House Museum in the West End on September 22nd, talking a little bit about my book, Vancouver Vice. I'm going to talk specifically about the crime history of the West End, as well as the Bachelor murders, which my friend Tom Crowder helped me investigate, and I go into here as well as the strange figure of and murder of Wayne Harris, whose body was found in the trunk of a car in Stanley Park, just off Lost Lagoon, on May 1st, 1984. So I think there's a handful of tickets left. Come to that if you want to hear me blab on about that. Do check out some more Word Vancouver stuff. Follow the Word Vancouver social media pages. I think it's one of the best literary festivals in the city, specifically because it focuses on Vancouver writers. I I love the Vancouver Writers Fest. All power to them, but so much of it is international people coming in, and it's not Vancouver stories being told. That's my one jab at the Vancouver Writers Festival that I won't wish they had more of. But this festival abounds with. In fact, it's all it's about. And in the spirit of localism and local stories and local history, uh, this one's aces for me, and it's always aces hanging out with you here at Aces. Yeah, cool. We'll be hanging around a little bit if you wanted to chat or if you had a question or anything like that. Thank you very much for coming. Do check out some more Word Vancouver stuff, and we'll see you around. Cheers.